Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bull Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex. As always, we are here today to talk about the Chargers cap situation after the first 2 weeks of free agency, where things stand on spending, and kind of what is the picture going into the 2025 NFL draft. And as we've seen in previous years, particularly last year, Joe Ortiz and company probably aren't done as far as when they signed Puna Ford last year, when they signed J.K. Dobbins. I do think they'll still pursue some of those free agents pre and post draft. I think post draft they also signed DJ Chark last year, right, as kind of a swing and receiver. So I think you'll see some of those types of signings going forward. Still some splashy, I guess, free agents out there. Not really, guys you're paying big money for at this point, though. Hence why I kind of wanted to do this cap overview just to talk about where they kind of stand after they've spent most of the big money, so to speak, in free agency. So I pulled up over the cap, and as you can see, they have this number here where the Chargers have about 30.87 million in salary cap space remaining. That number is a little bit technically off because as you scroll down here, Tony Jefferson is not in the list of names on the roster right now, and he just recently re-signed. But they do have every other cap hit in the system right now. So even if you add Tony Jefferson in, Tony Jefferson's likely to be a 1.1, 1.2 million veteran free agent signing. I believe his cap hit exactly when he signed last year was 1.2 million. So I would expect something like that again. And obviously his cap hit over the course of the season and stuff like that is a little bit flexible as far as will he be a top 51 roster cap hit, which there's a certain rule around that as far as does he count towards the offseason space or not. Right now he would count towards it. And then obviously Tony was somebody that we've seen fluctuate and oscillate between being on the practice squad last year, being on the main roster, right? So his contract would also change on the week depending on factors like that as well. So his cap hit is a little less concrete depending on whether or not he stays on the active roster the whole season, which as we've seen, he at this stage of his career, at least last year, was willing to be a little bit more flexible in his role in terms of, where he sort of appeared after he made the initial roster and kind of went back and forth between the main roster and the practice squad. So we'll kind of see where that lands. But even if you put Tony Jefferson at 1.2 million, right, you take that 30.8 million number that you see over there, and that would really put the Chargers at 30.87 minus 1.2. You could kind of do the math in your head, and that will put them at about 29.67 million, roughly, in cap space, depending on where that Tony Jefferson contract falls. And that's kind of their updated total is a hair under 30 million, so to speak, in cap space. But as we have seen a lot of times before, the Chargers also have to account for the draft picks that they're going to be making. They have 10 of them this year, as well as their in-season budget. And there are different estimates depending on, how much you want to dedicate towards the in-season budget. Our friend Daniel Popper, who has his own Substack calculation, which I'm not going to, necessarily show just because that's, his thing. He generally accounts for about 8 million as far as the in-season budget is concerned. And his current estimate for the draft budget is about 3.2 million. That's based on the Chargers having the 10 selections they have, right? So that's another example of if the Chargers were to trade up or if the Chargers were to trade down, that draft pick budget changes a little, right? For example, if the Chargers trade up in the second round and give up their fourth rounder, right, and now you have 9 picks instead of 10, that's, one less salary you would be committing to, hypothetically, right? And vice versa. If the Chargers trade back and they get an extra 6th or an extra 5th round pick, now you're signing 11 players, right? So that draft pick budget increases slightly to some extent. So that's kind of an example of something that we could see play out during the draft. But right now, that draft pick budget, so to speak, is at around $3.2 million, plus the in-season budget, which is around $8 million, so to speak, or at least the funds you want to have for that. So if you take the $29.67 million number that we just took after Tony Jefferson, who's not yet on the cap sheet, and you subtracted, let's just say, $11 million from about $29 million, that would leave the Chargers roughly a hair under $20 million left in, actual cap space, or as I like to call it, pure spending space that you can just spend on remaining free agents. So that would put them at about 18 or 19 million in that case. However, we also know that that's not quite as clear at this stage in the game, because we do know that Mr. Rashawn Slater, who is over here on Over the Cap, is due for an extension as a free agent in 2026. So we've talked a little bit about the Rashawn Slater extension and when that's going to happen and stuff like that throughout the offseason. As of now, I don't think anything is like imminent with the Chargers as far as when they have to get it done, primarily because it's not imminent. If you looked at what they've done in the past, the Chargers signed Justin Herbert, I believe, in July of 2023 was his extension. If you look at what they did with Joey Bosa and Keenan Allen back in 2020, right, that was about the time. It was July, August. They got back to training camp, right? So I think that's generally the timeline the Chargers have wanted to follow on some of these deals. As a result, that kind of changes when you're going to open some of that 2025 cap space up. And I did want to clear this up with Rashawn Slater, because I get questions a lot about like, oh, well, the 30 million or the 20 million they have left in salary cap space, that's just going to go to Slater, right? As if his cap hit is impacted in that kind of way this year, which is not the case. That was his contract would start in 2026, assuming he is and will be eventually extended. So as you see here, his 2025 cap hit is approximately $19.04 million, and that cap hit would decline and go down if the Chargers are able to agree to an extension with Slater. Just for reference, his draft classmate, who was recently extended, you can look at what happened with Penei Sewell, who had a pretty similar situation with Slater as far as his fifth-year cap hit, which if I remember correctly, was about $19.5 million. He was picked a little bit earlier than Slater. But the same thing essentially kind of happened with his cap number once he was extended. The same thing that we've kind of been talking about. As you see, his 2025 cap number went down about 10 million from 19.5 million to 9.54 million. So it kind of depends on what the final numbers of the Slater extension end up being. But roughly in a vacuum, the Slater extension will save 10 or 11 million against the 2025 cap whenever it does happen. So again, we just said that they're kind of a hair under 20 million in available pure spending cap space right now. If you add 10 or 11 million to that number sometime in July, sometime in August, I don't know if you're going to be, spending a ton on free agents, but you are going to have a little bit more towards in-season budget, things like trades, if the Chargers want to be active, say at the trade deadline, or as we saw them, with Elijah Molden and like a trade like that prior to the season starting, right? So if you want to be a little bit active on the trade market there, that kind of gives you the flexibility to do that. I do not think that they're going to necessarily use the money that they open up from Slater to go sign free agents. I don't think that that's necessarily going to happen. But I also think that knowing that you're probably getting that Slater extension done come July, come August, is also why they don't necessarily view the cap as like, oh, we have this 18, 19, 20 million left. I think that they realize that once that extension happens, they'll have a little bit more. Right now, the free agent market, anyway, doesn't really call for spending that 20 or 30 million. They will, I assume, kind of make some signings here or there, but there's nothing coming down the pike that they really have to do. We sort of talked about this maybe a little bit. If you go to the cap calculator, there are some options and stuff you can do as far as restructuring Justin Herbert, restructuring Derwin James. Again, right now they don't have to do that. As far as like opening routes to open up more cap space, I think that that's something that they could attack in later seasons. Not so much for Derwin, who will need a contract extension at some point. But for Justin Herbert, who just is in the first year of his extension, if they want to move money around, that's an option that kind of exists for them to pull money, into the cap space moving forward. So that's kind of just an idea, an overhaul of where the Chargers stand as far as their 2025 cap space situation. If you're talking about pure spending space, it's a little 20 million or slightly under that number. And if you're talking about the amount that they have as far as, total cap space, it's, over 29, 30 million, as we just discussed with the Tony Jefferson signing, not quite being posted yet, but not something that'll have a large impact either. So the Chargers do have some money left to spend, per these calculations and per everything we've kind of been talking about. So they could still be players on the free agent market. So therefore, I've pulled up our good folks over at PFF and wanted to kind of share, what free agents still kind of are available. Obviously, we've talked about a couple of them on the show. I know a lot of fans are into, potentially the Keenan Allen idea, which we'll get to in a second. But this is PFF's top, I think originally 100 free agent rankings or top 200, 300 free agent rankings. And this is just the guys who are kind of left now, as you see with Stephon Diggs, who just signed in New England. Not all of it is updated yet. So, that'll happen at some point. So obviously he's not available for the Chargers. I think Jameis Winston is also on this list. Not that they were going to sign him anyway. But, there's a couple guys who are actually signed that have not been updated on this list yet. So Amari Cooper, I still think is somebody that's worth talking about. Obviously it's been radio silent as far as his free agency, what his market is. But if you wanted to sort of bank on another X guy prior to the draft, I kind of wouldn't be surprised if they go in that direction. I do think he's probably a little bit older as far as his game and his play style than someone they necessarily want to go for. I think they probably rather take a younger X-type receiver in the draft while they also, have Mike Williams as one of their outside guys right now. So I don't really think that that's necessarily in play, but if his number came down to a point that they found kind of acceptable, I wouldn't be surprised if he was in play, although I don't think it's necessarily like something inevitable is going to happen there. There has been some like retirement talk online for Amari Cooper, but anyway, I think either way, he stands as a guy that is probably going to get done after the draft if he does sign with a team. So that's an idea for the Chargers. I think I really don't think that they go for it right now or after the draft. Maybe is something, again, that they can kind of approach down the road if the draft doesn't break their way as far as taking a receiver. But I would be pretty surprised with that at this point. So that is kind of one idea that the Chargers could potentially have there. Our good friend Asante Samuel Jr., also still a free agent. Again, don't think he's coming back to the Chargers by any means. I think he had a visit with the Cardinals, if I'm not mistaken. But it's been kind of radio silent on his free agency, which probably isn't that good for the Chargers, assuming they kind of wanted to add him into the comp pick formula, because depending on what contract he gets now, he may not qualify for that, but kind of see where his contract ends up. PFF had him before free agency with this 3-year, $14.5 million per year contract, which I always thought was like a little bit crazy entering free agency for a guy that missed a lot of time due to the shoulder stinger thing. And is the type of corner that Asante is, where like you kind of have to play him on the outside, but he doesn't have the ideal size to play the outside. You can't kind of play him in the slot because of the tackling issues. So yeah, I'll be curious to see where Asante's contract, wherever he does wind up, ends up, I guess. You have Mike Hilton here, Tyron Smith, and then of course the one everybody wants to talk about, Keenan Allen. So this one is worth bringing up in the sense that Mike Williams talked about him at the podium, and he talked about kind of wanting him back on the team, and was asked about him and was asked if he was recruiting him. But I do think it's worth monitoring Keenan Allen's market and like what he gets at this point, because PFF's like previous kind of extension note of like he could get $12.5 million per year. I'm kind of skeptical that really happens at this point. I wouldn't count out anything. I guess Stephon Diggs did just get 23, but I also think the Patriots were kind of desperate and like willing to overpay, versus I don't really think Keenan Allen kind of at his age is viewed that way around the league quite like Diggs, for example, still is. Down year last year in Chicago, again, still a very playable receiver. But I have some of the same questions and the same concerns that I think Daniel Popper and Steven talked about on their podcast a couple days ago, which is just to say that, if you want to have Ladd in the slot where he's most effective, you can't really put Keenan there quite as frequently. Now, Keenan in Chicago played about, I think, 50% of his snaps on the outside, and has been comfortable playing outside snaps when asked to do so, right? He sort of talked about that, I think, when Kellen Moore got hired, the idea of like being able to go back and forth between the outside and the inside. When Kellen Moore was hired, though, Keenan Allen was 2 or 3 years younger than he is now, right? And I do think wherever Keenan ends up, the ideal spot for him is kind of a slot spot where he's playing the amount of slot snaps that, say, Cooper Kupp played in Los Angeles last year, 65%. I really do think this is kind of, at almost 33 years old, kind of the place for Keenan and like his style of play specifically. So I do think, if they had taken a Neighbors, if they had taken a Brian Thomas, if they'd taken Marv or somebody like that last year, I kind of do think the Keenan thing would make a little bit more sense than it currently does. But right now, if you want to play Keenan in his kind of optimal role, you do have to take slot snaps away from Ladd, which I really don't think that they're prepared to do. Of course, there's like, a range of outcomes here, right? Meaning if Keenan were really willing to take a Mike Williams style contract from this team and, say $5 million guaranteed up to $9 million in incentives, right? Something like that for 1 year. If he was willing to do that, then I think there comes a point where the Chargers or Ortiz or, people like that would sort of bend, right? And be like, okay, now this is something worth pursuing. But if Keenan is sticking to, hey, I kind of want to make the most money possible, right, on this next contract, of 1 or 2 years, depending on kind of what a team gives him in the rest of free agency here, then I don't think it's as likely he returns. And obviously, the financial side in the last couple of years is important to him in his career, as we saw with his original trade request, where he became a Chicago Bear because he didn't want to take the pay cut. So I still think that's something that's probably going to be important to him as he sort of sorts out his market. If his market is not quite what he expected, and he ends up kind of being willing to take less from the Chargers, I think it's always something that can happen, and it's something that's notable because Keenan lives in California. He and Mike Williams are best friends. They go everywhere together. I think it is worth pointing out that this, he's always said he wants to kind of play in the Los Angeles area if he wasn't a Chicago Bear. So it's something to keep an eye on, although I think there are a lot of financial reasons as well as offensive reasons and schematic reasons that it probably won't happen. And again, I think Keenan, at this stage of his career, if he were to be a Charger again, would kind of have to sort of bend on things. I really want to talk about Calais Campbell, and I know Steven has mentioned him, but we've had the question of where is the Chargers' pass rushing juice, so to speak, coming from in this new group that has Deshaun Hand, Naquan Jones, you have Otito, you have Taylor. Not that Poona Ford was like this big pass rushing presence that they necessarily lost. That kind of wasn't necessarily his game. But they lost, about 57 pressures last year between Morgan Fox and Poona, who they let walk, right? So I do think this signing of Calais Campbell, he actually had more pressures individually himself last year than Poona, than Taylor and Morgan Fox. Morgan Fox was closest at 32. Calais Campbell was at 39. And he is going on 40 years old, as you see. He's about to, I think, turn 39 in a couple months here. But as a veteran D tackle signing, I really think he would kind of like kick ass. And if he's still a guy that at 40 years old can give you 40 pressures a season, I don't think there's a reason not to do it. I would love if that evaluation of him at 1 year, $3 million holds any weight. Get him in here, man. Like I think he makes a lot of sense for this team. Now he may want to kind of ring chase or go in another direction. We'll see if he still wants to play, which is kind of the first thing. I think Campbell would be kind of a later in the process type signing, depending on how much training camp he wants to do at 40 years old and all that stuff. But this is a guy that I still think is a really highly productive player. And if you want more pass rush juice, which they absolutely need to add in the draft, in the remainder of free agency, I don't love advocating for signing, older players who can hit a cliff, but you're talking about a defensive tackle over 35 years old who has averaged 40 pressures in each of the last 2 years. So like, to me, the Campbell train, so to speak, is like not stopping anytime soon. And I think the fact that he still has as well conditioned as he is, the longevity he's had, I would love if the Chargers signed Calais Campbell. I think he would answer a lot of questions in the short term prior to the draft that we have about the defensive tackle room, as far as, again, how are they getting to the quarterback? How are they getting those pass rush pressures? And Calais Campbell would answer a lot of those questions. Brandon Scherff is a guy that I think we've talked about as far as like, do they want to add another guard? I really don't think that they would be too particularly interested in Scherff at this stage of free agency. I think they kind of push guard to the draft. Kind of a guy that's played exclusively at right guard the last 5-6 years, I'm pretty sure. So I tend to think that with Becton and with Andre James and those two signings in particular to add to the interior offensive line, I think as far as the guard market's concerned, they're probably okay waiting to the draft at this point. J.K. Dobbins, a name worth talking about because obviously of the year he had last season. I really do feel bad for J.K. as far as his market is concerned because he kind of did everything he was kind of asked to do this season with the Chargers, which was, hey, go off, stay largely healthy. I know he missed the knee sprain for a couple games, but he had 900 yards most of his career. And unfortunately, he has run into the brick wall, which is this running back draft class. And as we saw with Najee's contract, Najee ended up getting probably a lot less than a lot of evaluators and capologists and stuff like that people projected for him, right? PFF, I think, had projected Najee to get 11 million. He ended up getting 5 in pure guarantees, up to 9 in incentives. And so this clearly has been a bit of a depreciated market for the backs, probably in part because of this running back class. And in the specific case of Dobbins, he is, that injury history, I think, will always unfortunately follow him. So it's a matter of what kind of role does he want, what teams are willing to sort of roll the dice with Dobbins, so to speak. I don't think the Chargers have shut any doors here, but I do think any Dobbins signing would likely come after the draft if maybe they aren't able to grab a running back or they don't love a fit in any of the rounds value-wise. Never say never as far as Dobbins coming back, but I do think their priority right now is clearly this running back draft class. So unfortunate for JK. Hope he ends up balling out and, showing teams why he deserves the kind of contract that he does deserve based off of, his production. But not looking great for him in free agency so far. Stephon Gilmore and Justin Simmons, again, I don't think they're touching the safety market as far as Simmons, especially after kind of re-signing Tony Jefferson. I think they could draft a safety, but I think signing one is off the table. Gilmore, I kind of don't see, although I guess they could kind of add him as like a body in the cornerback room. I sort of think that they, again, go in another direction, probably draft another corner at this stage in the game. Deontay Johnson. Deontay Johnson is, I think, at least a guy worth talking about. The Chargers did try to acquire him 2 separate times last year, both once he was traded from Carolina, as well as the waiver claim that they used on Deontay when he went to Houston. And this was after he had kind of flamed out with Jim Harbaugh's brother in Baltimore. I sort of, and I had this idea in the GAC group chat that we had, but like, if the Chargers look at the situation and they say, okay, this is a guy who is kind of clearly, bleeped, for lack of a better term, as far as current contractual projections, as far as current free agent market, because of how last year went for him. As well as the, off the field stuff he, sort of did last year as far as his presence in the locker room and all these things. I sort of wonder if there comes a point where they're like, hey, look, here's $2 million guaranteed, and you can get up to like 3 or 4 in incentives. And I say this because if they can just fix Deontay's brain a little bit, he does have the particular skill set that they are looking for as far as separation ability, as far as being able to kind of be a little bit of a tweener between play some outside receiver, play slot when he's asked to. So much of like their offense with the Mike Williams signing would make a little bit more sense with the Deontay signing. Now, again, I do not think anything's imminent. We'll see if someone at some point will sign Deontay and take that chance on him. But I've just kind of wondered if you look at, again, how they structured the DJ Chark contract last year, where it's basically like, all right, this is our, flyer deal to take so to speak, if this guy has anything left in the tank. I really could see them doing that with Deontay Johnson, and the fact that they did use a waiver claim on him last year, even after the flame out with John Harbaugh. I think that speaks to, hey, the Chargers are looking for talent, and if there's a guy that they can plug into their system that gives them some instant production, they'll consider it regardless. Not necessarily of all off the field stuff, but as long as the off the field stuff is football a little bit, if they can, kind of fix a guy, so to speak. So again, I don't think it happens, but because of the Chargers' previous interest in him, and because, there is still some filling out of the receiver room to do, I don't want to break the heart of the fan base, but I really think them signing Deontay Johnson on a, almost veteran minimum deal is probably a little bit more likely than them signing Keenan Allen to the number that he wants. So again, all in favor of Deontay if he can contribute and they feel that they can kind of fix him and rebuild his career at this point. Again, don't think it's going to happen. Don't think anything's imminent, but think their previous interest in him is worth kind of monitoring. Jameis Winston, obviously not available. Not that they were going to sign him anyway. Nick Chubb, obviously, is kind of a player that, coming back from the injury he came back from, wasn't quite as effective last year. But he would be a year removed from it. I sort of think the inevitability for this is honestly he winds up back in Cleveland again. I know he hasn't gotten a deal done yet, but I do think that is kind of what happens. Will Hernandez, again, a guy who suffered a knee injury last year, in particular, after being kind of a mainstay in Arizona, so to speak. So, again, I kind of think this is a thing where the Chargers probably don't address a second guard until the draft at this point, after signing Mekhi, after signing Andre James. Anything's possible, and I think them looking at the guard depth would be one thing, but I think if anything, this is kind of a post-draft type signing at this point. Old friend Eric Kendricks, he is available for sure. Dalton Reisner, again, another guard name that I think maybe is something to keep an eye on post-draft. Charles Omenihu is signed. Gotten some questions about Elijah Moore, who is still pretty young, but again, I really think the fact that you can only play him in the slot is like a pretty big limitation to the Chargers signing him potentially. Again, maybe the price is cheap enough that they would consider it anyway, but I just don't see a way that they kind of do it. Couple more signings to talk about. Tyler Boyd, I think for the same reasons, is kind of eliminated, in the same way that we kind of talked about the redundancy of a Keenan, the redundancy of, an Elijah Moore. I kind of don't see that potential. Tyus Bowser, interesting kind of like rotational fit type player. We talked a little bit about him last year, I think in free agency and late in the game when they were sort of still like looking for edge depth potentially. I guess we talked about a little bit about him prior to them signing maybe Bud Dupree last year. Spent some of the year with Seattle, and then was cut, and then spent some of the year with Miami following the injury to Jalen Phillips. Again, not a crazy productive player, but if they just wanted to look at it as, hey, we want to fortify our depth with kind of a guy that we know originally, from sort of that Ravens era, I could kind of see the purpose for the signing. Again, probably a post-draft thing, but if they bolstered the depth prior to the draft, it kind of wouldn't shock me. Trying to really think if there's any other fits that like stick out. Fularansu Fatukasi is like kind of interesting if you wanted to like take a chance on like a little bit of a rehab project, as we saw them do with Poona Ford last year. But I think Fatukasi is well distanced back from his prime in 2019, 2020. And then Poona Ford was distanced from, his last year so to speak. Not too many other free agents that interest me. Again, you could talk about any other receivers. DeAndre Carter actually just signed with the Browns, I think. Robert Woods, again, maybe an interesting guy if they want to like take a shot on him. But other than that, there's not really much available on the market at this stage in the game, as you can see. I guess my takeaway from that exercise is maybe a couple wide receivers they can take a flyer on, as well as maybe Tyus Bowser as an edge potentially. But I do love the idea of Calais Campbell. I will say that Calais Campbell is someone that I think is very, very appealing as far as boosting this pass rush in the short term, either before or after the draft. So would really like to see a Calais Campbell signing, as Stephen has already indicated to Tony Jefferson on Twitter and on the interwebs. So we'd love to see that. I think that'll do it for me today, guys. So hope you enjoyed this cap video and this free agency push video before we get into some of the draft content next week. So have some guests that I think I will be able to get coming on. So we'll just kind of leave it at that and see you guys next week for some of the draft content, and bolt up as always.